Okay, chapter 22 is about the heart. It is not the cardiovascular system. Notice that we've separated out blood, the heart, and blood vessels into entirely different chapters in entirely different weeks. So we're literally just looking at the heart this time. And as of today, we are only doing heart anatomy. So we're going to do the overview of the cardiovascular system. Let me get my laser pointer up. The anatomy of the heart, coronary circulation, how the heart muscle itself gets oxygen. And then we're going to go through the electrical properties of cardiac tissue and innervation. And I know that I said we're only doing half of it. That cardiac cycle is well over half of it. Cardiac cycle is quite a bit of information. That's what we're doing next week. So your heart can be divided functionally a couple of different ways. We can divide it into right and left. And later we're going to divide it into superior and inferior. So anatomically saying atria pump first, ventricles pump second. When we separate it right versus left, what we're actually separating out is the pulmonary circuit and the systemic circuit. Oh, sorry, that was systemic. This is pulmonary circuit. This is systemic circuit. What we mean by that is one side of the heart is responsible for receiving blood from the body and pumping it to the lungs, where it will get oxygenated. And the other side of the heart receives blood from the lungs and is responsible for pumping it to the body. So the right side of the heart is going to pump to the, this is from and then to the pulmonary circulation, whereas the left side of the heart is going to pump to the systemic circulation. And this image is a little bit weird because we've got a superior and an inferior for systemic circulation here. There is a reason for that. We're going to learn these vessels later. These are the vena cavae. This is going to receive deoxygenated blood from your head and from your arms, and this is going to receive deoxygenated blood from your trunk and lower limbs. So that's the reason that there's two here. Your head's up here, the rest of your body's down here. So again, right side of your heart pumps to the pulmonary circulation. The left side of your heart pumps all the way to your body. Which one do you think is more work? Just your lungs or your entire body? Entire body. Okay, that's going to come into play as well. The reason we need to pump to the lungs is for oxygenation, and the reason we need to pump to the body is to get that oxygen to the tissues. Why do tissues need oxygen? For perfusion. So it's perfusing your blood vessels with blood so that you can deliver oxygen. What are your cells of your tissues going to do with that oxygen? ATP. ATP, yes. Cellular respiration is the name for that. So these are going to undergo cellular respiration, and the byproduct of cellular respiration is carbon dioxide, right? So that's what's going to be found over here. Low oxygen, high carbon dioxide over on these deoxygenated areas. So we color code this in a hypothetical way as blue for deoxygenated and red for oxygenated. And of course then, once we've got that deoxygenated blood back to the heart, we have to send it back to the lungs so that we can get rid of that carbon dioxide and get more oxygen back in. So this is another topic where it's not necessarily cumulative on the exams, but again, we're already talking about the respiratory system, and that's not until Unit 3, right? So it's all going to tie in together from here on out. We've got a new definition of arteries and veins for you. Maybe once upon a time you thought that arteries carried oxygenated blood and veins carried deoxygenated blood. You always kind of thought of them as red and blue in your high school biology class. That is no longer going to be an appropriate definition for arteries and veins. The definition of an artery is that it carries blood away from the heart. And the definition for a vein is that it carries blood back to the heart. So let's go back to this picture really quick. Why can we no longer use arteries are oxygenated? Why are arteries only?
Because they're reversed in the lungs.
Because it's reversed in the lungs. This blue vessel right here that pumps deoxygenated blood to the lungs, that's the pulmonary artery. And these red vessels that carry oxygenated blood back to the left side of the heart, Those are pulmonary veins. So yeah, usually you can do red versus blue for arteries and veins, but not for the pulmonary circuit. Therefore, this is the definition we'll use. It'll even be on your worksheet today. You absolutely need that definition. As you can see, you have a number of very large blood vessels, either coming to the heart or pumping from the heart. Those are known as the great vessels. The heart is a pump, and like many pumps, the direction that fluid goes through this pump is unidirectional. It's only going one way. If it's going the wrong way, if it's going backwards, it's a problem. That's pathology. It's going to be unidirectional because of valves. We're going to have 4 valves in the heart, and they're all going to have names. And a couple of them are going to have a bunch of names. It wasn't my choice. I didn't name them. A lot of people, different people named them. When we measure blood pressure, we are actually measuring the force caused by the heart pump. We measure blood pressure in arteries that are very close to the heart so that we can get as accurate an assessment as possible as how much force is being exerted by that heart pump. So all of that blood pressure comes from a couple of things, blood volume, but today we're going to focus on the heart pump itself causing that blood pressure. So again, pulmonary circuit versus systemic circuit. If we're talking about the right side of the heart, what circuit are we pumping to? Pulmonary. And if we're talking about the left side of the heart, we are pumping to the systemic. Good. The heart is located within the pericardium and the pericardial cavity within the mediastinum or mediastinum, depending on who you ask, within the thoracic cavity, protected by the thoracic cage, and on that anterior surface, that ventral surface, we've got that sternum. What was the purpose of the pericardium? Fluid. Yep. So it's a double layer serous membrane that secretes a serous fluid, which means we've got a parietal and visceral layer. Visceral layer is going to be where? Attached to the organ itself, and then the parietal is going to be facing the body wall out. Yes. So here is that. In addition to that simple serous membrane, you're also going to have a fibrous pericardium surrounding that. So you've got the fibrous pericardium, and that's going to be a thick, tough, protective layer. And later this semester, we will actually be able to see some fibrous pericardiums when we go into the thoracic cavity of our field pigs. Our sheep hearts have already had pericardium removed, however. So from superficial to deep, we go fibrous pericardium, parietal layer of serous pericardium, and remember this is a continuous membrane, but when it does this U-turn here and comes around to adhere to the surface of the heart, we're calling that the visceral layer of the serous pericardium. Now there's a little tiny detail right here that I want you guys to see. The visceral layer of the serous pericardium is synonymous with the epicardium, because down here we're going to have epicardium, myocardium, and endocardium. So how are we going to translate epicardium? Above the heart, yeah. And then myocardium, how are we going to translate that? Muscle. So these are cardiomyocytes. The entirety of this thickness, aside from blood supply and some other stuff, it's all going to be cardiomyocytes. So that's going to be the myocardium. This entire thickness is myocardium. And then how are we going to translate endocardium? Within, yeah. So within the heart. So one more time, superficial to deep. Fibrous pericardium, parietal layer of serous pericardium, visceral layer of serous pericardium, which is the same thing as the epicardium, which then will be superficial to the myocardium, and then that innermost layer facing the lumen is the endocardium. Now, why might every single one of these terms be important for you? Think of some medical conditions involving the heart. Can you think of some and name them? Cardiac tamponade, that's going to be related to the pericardial cavity filling with fluid, restricting movement of the heart. Good. Cardiomyopathy, problem with the musculature of the heart. Good. Anything else? What about endocarditis? Has anybody ever heard of endocarditis? Inflammation of that innermost layer of the heart? Pericarditis, there we go. So it keeps on going on. There's going to be terminology for every single one of these. So you do absolutely need every single layer there. Is that making sense? Here is another image, and I think you have on your lab practical images both of these options for layers of the heart. You could label epicardium, myocardium, endocardium there, or you could label epicardium, myocardium, endocardium here. This gives you a little bit more of a histology view. And you can even see that those are cardiomyocytes. So now we're going to go way back to that tissues lecture and recognize those branched, usually uninucleated, cardiomyocytes with, what's that cool feature that allows them to communicate? The discs, what are they called? Starts with an I. Intercalated discs, which contain what type of cell-to-cell junction? Gap junctions, good. That's coming back too. It never really goes away, right? Never really goes away. Notice that there's a variable layer of connective tissue, adipose tissue, along that epicardium, or sandwiched within that epicardium. We are going to see quite a bit of adipose on the sheep hearts, and there's generally a lot around the humans too. Again, some of it's protective. Obviously, it's possible to have too much fat surrounding your heart, but it is a standard feature of hearts to be embedded in a certain amount of fat for protection. All right, here's another note for you, another detail. The heart valves, there's going to be 4 major valves. They are going to be partially derived from endocardium, which means if you have endocarditis, you could end up with a problem with your heart valves. Are we ready to get into some superficial anatomy? Cool, let's do this. So, great vessels. Let's start from great vessels and then we'll work our way in. Anterior view. This is probably the high school biology view that you're used to. That posterior view is going to be a little bit more of an intellectual challenge. So, high school view. Anterior view, notice that the heart is deflected to the left. This part right here is going to be known as the apex of the heart. This up here is going to be the base of the heart. You have 2 vena cavae, vena cava, vena cavae. And those mean basically cavernous vessels or big veins, right? They are both going to the same place. The superior vena cava and inferior vena cava are both returning deoxygenated blood from the body to the right side of the heart. Next largest vessel is the aorta. The aorta receives oxygenated blood from the left side of the heart and pumps oxygenated blood to the body. So it is your biggest artery. You have this arch right here. So this is actually ascending aorta, aortic arch. And when it starts descending, that's the descending aorta. And this vessel right here is continuous with this vessel right here. It's simply deflected to the left and traveling posterior to the heart. This right here is coming from here. We'll worry about ventricles and atria later. This is the pulmonary trunk, and this is the pulmonary artery. So again, we can't use red and blue for arteries and veins anymore. This is the pulmonary artery, This is taking deoxygenated blood from the right side of the heart to the lungs. And since it's carrying blood away from the heart, it is therefore an artery. And you can use a lot of linguistics here too, and I recommend that you do. Pulmonary means lungs, absolutely. So you can just say, okay, that's a pulmonary vessel of some kind, is it an artery or vein, and then rule it out from there. They're less visible, but you will generally see this number right here of pulmonary veins. So the lungs are literally right here. So they've cut this off right at where the lungs are. It doesn't get any longer than this. They just spread into the lungs themselves. So these coming back from the lungs, those are pulmonary veins. Those go to the left side of the heart. And then again, comes back out the aorta. So far, so good? Okay. You've also got some great vessels. We'll worry more about the coronary circulation in a bit. But you can use this as a superficial landmark to tell you some of what's going on deep to these structures. This is actually going to be the physical outward border between the left and right ventricle, but we'll get into ventricles later. Posterior view, same exact vessels, same exact structures. There's one more thing that we really want to pay attention to here. In addition to that aorta, the superior and inferior vena cava, and one good thing about this illustration is you can see that they really are going to the same place. They kind of look continuous from this view. If you've got your physical heart models out, you can confirm that on your physical heart model. That they're going to the same place, they're going to what's deep to this structure, it's going to be the right atrium. This is going to be that posterior surface where you have those pulmonary veins coming in. Since they're going to the left side of the heart, that's going to be your posterior surface of your left atrium. Here's the posterior view of those pulmonary arteries. You can't see the pulmonary trunk as well because it's anterior to the structure. Okay, also back here on the posterior surface is this coronary sinus. And again, we'll have more time to get into this anatomy later with these coronary vessels. But this is going to drain deoxygenated blood from the heart wall itself, and it's also returning it to the same place these vena cavae are going. All deoxygenated blood is destined for the same location in the right atrium. So there's actually going to be a little opening deep to where my laser pointer is right now. Superficially, just like you had on the anterior surface, these blood vessels giving you a superficial marker for the division between the left and right ventricles. Okay. Those vessels travel in sulci, or sulci, depending on who you talk to. What's a sulcus? A groove. An invagination, a sticky innie bit, to use our AMP1 terminology. So these coronary vessels right here are located within coronary sulci. You have an anterior interventricular sulcus and a posterior interventricular sulcus. Just break down those words for me. It's on the anterior surface. If it's inter, then it's between. And if it's ventricular, then it's between what structures? Ventricles. Good. And if it's a sulcus, it's dipping down into it, which means it's a great groove for things like blood vessels to be within. All right, which sulcus are these vessels going to be found within? Anterior interventricular sulcus. Posterior view. What will these be? What divot will these be in? Posterior interventricular sulcus. Okay, let's do a little bit more with atria and ventricles and then come back to this concept. So now we cut that heart open, and if you've got a physical copy in front of you, I recommend opening yours up and taking a look inside and tracking all of this down in 3 dimensions, because going from 2D to 3D is a very complicated thing. That's why I hand out all those physical models. So again, Base is up here, apex is down here. This is the superior direction, this is inferior direction. Towards the base of the heart, the superior portion of the heart, you have atria. Make sure I'm doing this right way. Right and left atrium. These are your atria. They are divided from each other physically. There is an atrial septum. What's a septum? It's a what?
Like a space.
Kind of a space. So a physical separation. Like this is your nasal septum, right? So it's separating the right from the left atrium is the atrial septum. There's your right atrium, there's your left atrium. Your left atrium in this image is partially obscured by our visual for the pulmonary trunk. Superficial to your atria, you have a feature known as an auricle. A-U-R-I-C-L-E, auricle. I call these the flappy bits. And I'm not exaggerating, when the heart beats, they actually just kind of go and they flap up like this, like a little bird. Flap, flap, flap. So they kind of add extra room to the auricles without necessarily contributing to the contraction of them. And that's really all I've got for you in terms of form and function for those. They're the flappy bits. You will be able to locate a left and right auricle. So here is a very obvious right auricle. See how it's kind of flappy on top of that cardiac muscle tissue. And then there's that flappy bit on this side. You guys like my flappy bit terminology? It's pretty good. I like it. So your atria have auricles that flap up when they contract. For both right and left sides, you have valves on your way into the ventricles. Collectively, these are known as atrioventricular valves. And I think that's a nice linguistic name. If you just want to stick with right and left AV valves, you can do that. If you want to specialize in something involving cardiology at all, I want you to be sure that you recognize every single variation on this name. In general, I recommend being able to recognize each. But if I point to this and you say that that's the right AV valve, you are correct. That is the right atrioventricular valve. Let's go through some different names for right and left AV valves. The right AV valve has 3 cusps. So if you were going to name that, what would you name it?
Tricuspid.
Tricuspid. And the left AV valve has 2 cusps. So what might you call it? Bicuspid. But that wasn't enough. We've got to give lefty here one more name. Mitral. Yep. Yeah, I know. I didn't decide on it. It wasn't me. So again, right AV valve, tricuspid, left AV valve, bicuspid, also mitral valve. The larger chambers for both sides of your heart are the ventricles. They are near the apex, whereas those atria were near the base. Once again, you have an interventricular septum. Again, when all of this terminology starts to get overwhelming, just break it down linguistically. Okay, what septum is this? Well, it's the one between the ventricles. That means it's the interventricular septum. Superficial to this is that interventricular sulcus. Two more valves. So these valves are going to be on the way out of the heart. We've got this valve that's going to that pulmonary trunk. And the cool thing about these valves is that they kind of have a half moon shape. So if you were going to name a half moon shaped valve on the way to the lungs, what would you call it? Pulmonary semilunar valve would be a great choice for that. Yes. Lots of linguistics here to use. All right, if you were going to name that half moon shaped valve on the way to the aorta, what would you call it? The aortic semilunar valve would be an excellent choice for that. And once again, some other people got in on the naming convention. Some people will refer to this as the pulmonic valve in addition to the semilunar or pulmonary semilunar valve. Okay, we're good there. In addition to your cardiomyocytes, your epicardium, your endocardium, you have another type of tissue throughout your heart known as the fibrous skeleton. It's a type of dense, regular connective tissue. It's going to lend structural support, and highlighted in blue here, the words electrical insulator. So let's start thinking about how that heart is actually going to contract. The atria are going to contract together, the ventricles are going to contract together, and you have all those cardiomyocytes in a pattern that's going to allow for that contraction all at that same time. We do have to have it happen at separate times, but you have those intercalated discs with gap junctions, meaning that if it's happening in this cardiomyocyte, by definition, it's also going to happen in that cardiomyocyte, because those intercalated discs all along those connections are going to spread that electrical signal very, very quickly, right? That means your atria go like that. They're going to contract all at once. It would be very, very ineffective if your whole heart, including ventricles, contracted at the same time. Instead of pumping blood from here to here and here to there, we're just going to squeeze everything out like a sponge all at once, and stuff's not moving forward, it's just being squeezed, right? Therefore, the fibrous skeleton of the heart and its role as an electrical insulator is very, very important to you. If we did not have that electrical insulation, we would have less coordination. We wouldn't have atria than ventricles. We would have something different and less useful for us. All right, what's important about the fibrous skeleton? It's an electrical insulator. What else does it do? Physically separates atria from ventricles, and it's a structural support. You're also going to see on this image right here that part of those valves, aside from that endocardium, part of those valves are actually derived from that fibrous skeleton as well. So it's basically fibrous skeleton covered by endothelium, or endocardium in this case. One thing that's been confusing for people in the past about this particular image, which is found in your lab practical images, is that these are two separate concepts. I recommend starring this in some way, maybe drawing a big old line right here and saying this is the concept of the fibrous skeleton of the heart. Down here, this is actually the concept of how those cardiomyocytes are aligned to create the different directions of contraction when the heart beats. So that ridiculous dance I was doing earlier, the dance that can be found in a YouTube video known as Living Arrhythmias, which we will watch later, and I will mention in here and link to on our modules, but will probably not show up on the screen if I put YouTube on my computer. There's a reason that the arms go this way and the legs bend. These are different orientations of cardiomyocytes as they contract. So the atria contract in an inward circumferential way, whereas the ventricles, their job is to send blood in the superior direction. If we go back here real quick and we see when this contracts, it's sending blood up superiorly in this direction. And when this ventricle contracts, it's sending blood up this way to the aorta. So in order for it to get blood against gravity from here up here, we're going to squeeze it like a tube of toothpaste. It's going to contract from the bottom on up. And that is the significance of this image down here, showing you the orientation of those cardiomyocytes in such a way that it can squeeze from the bottom. Here's another image with that same concept. So the atria contract in an inward direction, the ventricles contract such that that contraction will cause blood to move in a superior direction. So these two pictures, same concept, different concept. Different concept. Now we're going to kind of go one chamber at a time. If you were a red blood cell, you would start in the right atrium. You would be deoxygenated, you would have come from the body, you would be delivered either from the superior or inferior vena cava into the right atrium, or perhaps the coronary sinus, but we're going to go from the body right now. This is if you took a slice of that auricle and that superficial atrium and peeled that away to give you a, this is kind of a weird view, I'm going to call this a left superior view of the heart. Now again, you've got your physical models in front of you. It may be a good idea to orient that heart in front of you right now. Make sure that that vena cava is facing your left hand. Make sure the apex is facing your right hand, and locate that right atrium superficially. We find it? So if you peel that away, this is the view you would have. You're looking down towards the ventricles. What valve would this be? This would be the tricuspid valve right here. Is anybody but Debbie getting this? Because I know Debbie's had this before. It's okay, you're allowed to speak up. It's great, and it's awesome that you love the heart. I want to make sure everyone else is getting it too, though. Yeah. Okay, what's the other name? Not Debbie? Right atrioventricular valve, good. Anatomically, you also have this guy right here. He's going to be known as the fossa ovalis for labeling purposes. I think the picture that you get is slightly different. I do think you can visualize the fossa ovalis in your lab practical images. If somebody is, air quotes, born with a hole in their heart, it's usually a septal defect, not a physical hole on the surface of the heart. It's usually, instead of having a fossa ovalis, you have a hole here known as a foramen ovale. Not to be confused with the foramen ovale up here. Foramen ovale in here. And embryologically, I can explain that, but we'll do it later.
They can fix over time, right? Like your body can form.
Over time, some of them will naturally close. They're also surgical interventions.
Right.
Yep.
If you're symptomatic.
If there's, yeah, they're acyanotic. Acyanotic defects is what we say in patho. They're not going to be the best at sports, but they'll be alive.
So the PFO, is that a perforated foramen ovalis?
Probably, yeah. All right, we went through the right ventricle. We're still a red blood cell. We started in the right atrium. Now we're in the right ventricle. We came through that tricuspid or right AV valve to make it to the right ventricle. In here, when we take a good look at the structure, we've got this rugosity, these foldy folds inside of the heart wall with the endocardium following every single groove. Those are called trabeculae carnae. Over to the left is going to be the interventricular septum. You're also going to have, let's see, this guy up here. Notice there's this kind of smooth region before we get to that pulmonary trunk. And for some reason in this image, the pulmonary trunk is in red, which is a little weird. This is going to be the conus arteriosus, and I think that's another word that some people have a hard time labeling. So the conus arteriosus is the smooth region in the right ventricle that is on the way to the pulmonary semilunar valve.
Conus what?
Arteriosus, if I'm getting that right, I might see it. The right semilunar valve or the pulmonary semilunar valve. Right now we're looking at an anterior view.
Okay, so we were looking at it like this.
So we started in the right atrium when we were looking at it in the atrium. Do you want me to hold it?
Other way. Yeah.
So we started from this view, looking down at that right AV valve. Now we're just back to this view. So we're in the right ventricle. Here's your right AV. I haven't always had these physical models out while I do this lecture. I think I'm really happy with having these physical models out for this lecture. In addition to trabeculae carnae, you're also going to have these little muscular features These are papillary muscles, and they connect to the heartstrings, literal strings of the heart. Those are connected to the AV valves. Those are called chordae tendineae, and that's on the next slide. So papillary muscles attach to chordae tendineae, which attach to the cusps of the, in this case, tricuspid valve. They're there to prevent backflow. So these are the valves that keep this pump moving fluid only in one direction. If these were to be weakened, or if that valve were to be weakened, instead of a nice shutting of that valve, we'd get some flapping of that valve, and then fluid would not be pushed forward as easily. And that's going to cause a lot of problems if that happens. And there's that conus arteriosus I was talking about before. So the roof of the ventricle, especially the right ventricle, that leads to that semilunar valve. That's the conus arteriosus. And we should be able to find that to a degree in our sheep hearts next week. All right, we're still a red blood cell. We made it from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And now that right ventricle wall is going to contract, and it's going to push us into the pulmonary arteries and over to the lungs, where we'll be oxygenated. And then it's going to come back to the left atrium. So on your physical models, locate your left atrium. This is a posterolateral view, a little to the left, with the posterior surface cut open like a flap. There's the left auricle, the flappy bit. There's the indentation for the foramen ovale on this side. Again, in an adult, it shouldn't be a foramen ovale, it should be a fossa ovalis. And if we were to look down in this direction towards the left ventricle, what valve would we see? Left AV valve, also known as bicuspid or mitral, absolutely. The little white thing in your model, yeah. Yours are kind of weird. Some of these models are better than others for representing cusps. I think I actually gave the best one for cusps to the back row, or maybe it's you guys in the middle, I don't remember. Okay, now we made it. Are we oxygenated or deoxygenated at this point? Oxygenated, excellent. Now we made it through that left AV bicuspid mitral valve into the left ventricle, and once again we have those trabeculae carinae, we have papillary muscles, we have those chordae tendineae, the heartstrings. And when this heart wall contracts, we're going to go through which valve out to the body? Aortic semilunar valve, absolutely. Okay, another detail for you. Left ventricle wall is typically 3 times thicker than the right. Let's go backwards for a little bit and appreciate that on this image. Here's the heart wall on this side, here's the heart wall on this side. Why is this 3 times thicker? More force to contract to get that blood to out to the body. This is only contracting to the lungs. That's pretty close by. It doesn't really take that much. This is going to your entire body, so it's going to be relatively thick. So hypothetically, just to prepare you for patho, what would happen if this had to work a lot harder to pump blood out? It's going to get thicker. Let's say it doesn't exclusively get thicker this way. Let's say it gets thicker this way too. What's going to happen to that space? It's going to get smaller. Yep, so even as it's working harder to try to get more blood out, it's going to be able to contain less blood to pump out to the body for each heartbeat. So it's going to be a downward spiral. It's going to pump out less blood, so it's going to work harder. So it's going to pump out less blood, so it's going to get harder.
That would be, yeah, left-sided.
Cardiomegaly is immediately what we're talking about, but it can absolutely play into left-sided heart failure, yes. Now that aorta is taking oxygenated blood everywhere, And it starts as a very, very big vessel, and those vessels generally get progressively smaller as we go. With one exception, the coronary arteries. Obviously, since that heart has to beat every moment of every day of your entire life, getting it oxygen is going to be a really, really high priority. But we can't exactly have gigantic honkin' vessels on this small area, so we actually have relatively small vessels coming immediately off of that aorta. And that is the left and right coronary artery. This is going to be an area of really, really high blood pressure, and these are going to be relatively small vessels to handle that high blood pressure. So this is going to be a really, really convenient place for you to drop off some of that cholesterol and fat that you've been eating, and I include myself in that statement. I'm not attacking my students right now. So this is going to be a really vulnerable location in particular. The most important place to get oxygenated is also going to be the easiest place to clog with some of our dietary fats and sugars. So we've got some more terms here. Let's see. Are we ready to forge ahead, or did we want to review any vocabulary before we moved on? I'm piling on a lot of vocab. That's why today is just about anatomy.
So all of everything that's red right here, like the coronary artery.
Yeah, so left coronary artery is then going to split a couple of times, and then right coronary artery is then going to split a couple of times. And we do have some specific vessels that split from these coronary arteries. Later we're going to have coronary veins as well. We're going to need to know and label those specific ones as well. Okay, I'll forge ahead for a few more minutes before calling our first break. Left coronary artery is going to give way to, and if you're going to name this, it would be very consistent with every other naming convention we've seen here, the anterior interventricular artery. It's on the anterior surface. It's between the two ventricles. It's located in the interventricular sulcus. So that's a really common naming convention that's applying to multiple things in this location, right? That makes your life a little bit easier. That having been said, if you are a cardiovascular surgeon and about 3/4 of your workload is doing bypass surgery on this blood vessel right here, you're probably not going to want to say anterior interventricular artery every day of your life. You're probably going to call it left anterior descending, LAD. Yeah. So either LAD, left anterior descending, or anterior interventricular artery are acceptable for lab practical purposes. You should learn to recognize both. Left anterior descending, LAD. Yep. The other branch of the left coronary artery is the circumflex artery. And that's going to reach around to the posterior surface of the heart. But we're actually going to get most of our oxygenation to the posterior surface of the heart via the right coronary artery. Major branches that you're going to need to know for the right coronary artery include this right marginal artery right here. See how this is coming to join and meet up with that LAD right there? And then, I don't know how well it's reading on the PowerPoint, it doesn't look too bad today. This is sort of grayed out because this is a 3D image showing you the posterior aspect of the heart. So you have to think of this in 3 dimensions. If this is the anterior interventricular artery and this is 3-dimensionally the posterior view, what they're showing you right here, what do you think you're going to name that blood vessel? Exactly, posterior interventricular artery. Use those naming conventions. And that's it. Those are the ones I care about for arteries. We've got a whole other set and a different naming convention for the veins. So this is still an anterior view. You're going to notice you don't have a big arching thing to either of those vena cavae. Instead, you have that coronary sinus on the posterior aspect. Again, all that's happening here is that it's draining deoxygenated blood from the heart wall And it's delivering it all to that coronary sinus, which delivers it back to the right atrium. So three-dimensionally, this hole that you can see right here, that's leading to the right atrium. Instead of using anterior, posterior, interventricular, etc., we have a great, a middle, and a small cardiac vein, all draining to the coronary sinus. Now, I have heard this with other naming conventions. I have heard this as anterior interventricular vein. I have heard this before as posterior interventricular vein. I don't know how common that usage is. I would stick with great, middle, and small. Yes?
You said they drain the coronary sinus?
Yes. Posterior aspect of the heart. Do you want me to go to the slide where it showed us that view as well? Okay. It's going to be quite a ways back, so zoom, 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 zoom. Here it is. There's that coronary sinus. And you can see that on here too. Here's the middle cardiac vein. I don't think this has a view of the small cardiac vein. I think that's something else. Okay, back to slide 29. All right, I'm going to go ahead and pause it so that we can take a legitimate break.